Hello, everybody. Happy Monday, another week in Genesis. We're going to have a great one. We are going to talk about 13 and 14 today, or hopefully you've read 13 and 14, and then we'll just pull out some quick observations in this video. But I just want to backtrack a little bit because last time, even though I did a really long video, I still didn't finish Genesis 12. Sorry about that. But I just want to quickly touch base on it because what we were talking about last time is that Abram is a great father of the faith, but he still has to learn faith. He still has to grow in faith. It's not fully formed within him. God gives him this incredible promise in Genesis 12, and he half obeys what God asks him to do. God says, leave your family behind. Abram leaves most of them behind. He says, go to the land that I'm calling you. And then he gives him this incredible promise in the land that he's called to. And then in verse 10, we see Abram's first real test, which is that there's a great famine in the land that he's called to. And so instead of staying where God has promised him blessing and provision and abundance and that nations will come from him, that those who curse him will be cursed, instead of staying in that land that God clearly outlines for him, Abram does what he thinks is going to bring him to prosperity. He goes to the place where he can see richness. He takes matters into his own hands and he goes to Egypt. Now, we don't know what would have happened if he'd have stayed where he was in that promised land. What we do know is that Egypt brings some complication. And I think sometimes when we half obey God, it's not that he won't bless us. God blesses Abram a lot in Egypt. And we know that when he comes back, he's even richer than he was before. In fact, he's quite rich, interestingly, before the promise of God comes. But there are blessings that we can get in our own strength, and then there are blessings that God can give us when we obey him, and one far outweighs the other. So we know that Egypt provides prosperity for Abram, but life is about so much more than prosperity. And Egypt also provides long term quite a complication for Abram. In fact, Egypt is where his wife is given the slave girl Hagar, who then ends up being quite a complicated part of the story later in Genesis, which we'll read. But I just think it's interesting that he takes matters into his own hands. He tries to provide the solution himself. And Egypt is not necessarily the answer to all his problems that he thought it might be. We have to trust what God says to us. And if he says, this is the land I'm calling you to, stay in the land he's calling you to. But what we see happening is that when he comes back, he ends up back in the place he started. It says in 13 verse 3, he went back, he put his tent where it had been right at the beginning. So he's come back full circle. But what we know is that he has at least learnt. God has brought me back faithfully. And it says he builds an altar and again gives God praises. Abram and Lot have a bit of conflict. They've got so much between them that they need to separate and go their own way. Abram gives Lot the choice of where it is that he's going to settle. And Lot looks with his eyes, sees where it's fertile, and goes for that land, which makes sense, doesn't it? But we've got to make decisions not only based on what we see and what looks promising, but on what God is leading us to. You know, God can do more in a barren land that you are called to than he can in a fertile land where you shouldn't be. And it turns out that Lot didn't make the best decision because he ends up getting taken captive later on in this chapter. But or in the next chapter, sorry. But Abram separates from Lot, which is exactly what he was called to do at the beginning. It's a part of what God asks of him. And then, despite having the seemingly inferior land, God says to Abram, lift up your eyes. And then there's this incredible kind of secondary or repeat of the blessing that we heard about in Genesis 12. It says, I will make your offspring as dust of the earth, if you can count the dust. That's how your offspring could be counted. And what I love about this is that God says to Abram, arise, walk through the length and breadth of this land. You know, God wants us to enjoy the promises that we're given. We shouldn't be afraid of them. We shouldn't be scared to touch the things that he's placed in our lives or afraid that we're going to break something. If God has entrusted it to us, he wants us to enjoy it. God actually wants to bless us and for us to have good things. And so he gives Abram this blessing and then he says, go and explore the blessing. Go and walk right through it. Go and stretch its potential. Go and find every element that could be of joy to you. I just love the heart of God that wants us to explore and enjoy everything that he's given us. He doesn't want us to tolerate our gifts or hide from our gifts. He actually wants us to expand them and share them. I don't know if you can hear my kids in the background, but I need to go and put them to bed. So what we find out then in Genesis 14 is that Lot did make a bad decision in settling in the land of Sodom. The king of Sodom has a war with some other kings. Lot gets taken captive. Abram goes and saves him because he's still family and he still knows that that is the right thing to do. And ultimately, we hear this amazing victory on the hand of Abram, and it's the confirmation of Genesis 12 promise that says, God says, I'm going to bless those who bless you, and I'm going to curse those who curse you. And you better not, get on the wrong side of Abram, because God is right behind him. And we finish up with this little passage about Melchizedek, this mysterious priest who I'm sure we will talk more about another time. We don't know where he comes from. We don't know why he's here in Canaan. We don't really know anything about him. But we do know that he blesses Abram and Abram blesses him. It's almost like a blessing battle, just like a competition of them sharing resource and wealth and food and just all of these like abundances that they have in their life. Their desire is not to hold them for themselves, but it's to see another man of God and to share what they have. And that should be our same aim too, that we should recognize our blessings and want to share them with others. So you've just got this abundantly generous priest who is met, and he's significant. He's a significant character. We'll talk about him another time. But the king is grateful to Abram and says, you take whatever you want from the spoils. And Abram says, no, I will not get rich on the hands of man. And I think this is a lesson in part of this growing faith that I'm talking about. Abram went to Egypt and he did grow rich, but he realized this is not the richness that I want, the richness that's from my own planning, the richness that is by my own hand. I don't want that kind of wealth. I want the wealth of the promise that God is giving to me. And so when the king of Sodom says, take what you want, he says, no, I'm not here to get rich by anybody other than God. And so he kind of stays true to that promise, which I think is amazing. Okay, see you tomorrow for Genesis 15 and 16.